Hello, Laynie.
Hi, Al.
We've reached week 6 of ModPost's 10-week run. And I just want to remind everybody that if you're in the symposium mode, which happens in the North Hemisphere autumn, September through mid-November, you're running through 10 weeks with us somewhat synchronously. But if you're encountering ModPo any other time of the year, the only significance of saying we're in week 6 is that it is following 1 through 5. But you can do week 6 in 5 weeks or 10 weeks or a year. And in fact, week 6 would be great to do over the course of the year because it's about the beats. Why might it be kind of an endless thing, full of depth? What's going on with the beats that is so generative?
Well, I mean, you can do any week, any time of year,
That's
just
true.
saying. But
Of course.
why are the beats generative?
Yeah.
Well, there's Allen Ginsberg, for example, who raises up the energy of a room he would walk into, or the page that you're reading, or what you're listening to.
For instance, when he performed his poems.
When he performed and sang and brought everybody into the space of what he was doing. It's a very activating week, beat week. It gets you up and running.
And performance is a very interesting topic to pause on here because although there were poets who performed, Vachel Lindsay, Carl Sandburg, and in the 19th century, someone like Tennyson as the poet laureate would go around England performing his poems. But it's only when you get to the beats and the other new American poets movements, but we're focusing on the beats here, where you get such a primary, a central importance of the performance. So now more than ever, when you look at the syllabus, click on those audio files because almost all of them point to an archive called Pen Sound, which, like ModPo and like Poem Talk and like Jacket 2, is a project that emanates out of this Kelly Writers House. And so Pen Sound is full of audio, and there are probably 3 or 4 audio files of a poem like America or Howl just in the Pen Sound archive. And what we've done in ModPo is we've selected one of them. Anyway, performance is incredibly important. Yeah, okay, so let me just take a pause here. It is indeed week 6, module 11. And each of the weeks, each of the sections of our course have a head note. And it's important, we haven't mentioned this before, but it's important for you to look on the main syllabus and expand that head note so you can read the whole thing. The head notes provide something of an overview that we're doing here. Okay, so who are some of the poets that we encounter among the beats in this tiny sampling of ModPo's main syllabus?
Well, we mentioned Ginsberg. We also have Anne Waldman.
Anne Waldman,
who is
who
also
might be called a second-generation beat and a second-generation New York school poet, maybe?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Also an amazing performer. And
a friend of Ginsberg, though they were different generation.
Right, and a friend of Writers House. So
yes,
if you look at her Pen Sound page, you'll see lots of recordings, many here.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else worth mentioning among the beats?
They're all worth mentioning.
Yeah.
We've got Bob Kaufman.
Bob Kaufman, a really important figure in ModPo, absolutely. And there's Robert Creeley, who is not a beat, who was friends of the beats. And Creeley has a poem that is, in a way, a satire of beat attitudes, but is also a bit beat. I Know a Man. We wanted to get Creeley in here, and this actually makes me want to say something a little too poetic historical for ModPo, which is a general interest that is very agnostic about being too particular about sub-movements and so forth. But the rise of the beats coincided with the general rise of what became known, for better or worse, as the new American poetry. So you had clusters of poets, all of whom come together in an anthology called the New American Poetry in 1960. But through the 50s, the beats are only one part of that generation of post-war poets. And as with imagism in week 3, here we're just selecting the beats as a good example, but there's so much more out there. So can we just say what are some of the qualities typically of the beat poetry that we're encountering here? I'll start. Long lines as opposed to short lines, typically, not exclusively.
I want to say call and response.
Call
In
and
other
response.
words, everybody is invited to participate sometimes in some of these performances. In other words, performance is not just the person on a stage, but there's an interaction that's happening.
Yeah. So one way of stressing the intersubjectivity that is all throughout the Mod Po poems from the beginning is to actually have a performance where the performer is altered by the response of the audience. A great example would be the very first time that Ginsberg performed the poem America, which wasn't yet actually printed. And the response of the mostly inebriated audience encouraged him to see that poem as ironic and antic and funny. Because when you hear him read it in other contexts, he reads it very seriously. So that's a great example. Another quality of the beats that is distinct, noteworthy.
Well, I want to mention Jane Cortez, and I want to mention music.
Yeah.
So music and poetry, there's always a relationship there, but we see this in the beats, and particularly in the performance that we have of Jane Cortez. It's pretty spectacular, very, very rhythmic, connection to jazz. Although jazz is not the only music that's important to the beats, it's certainly central.
And we encounter Jack Kerouac in this chapter, and I think Kerouac is thought of as in my opinion, kind of a somewhat mediocre novelist. That would be my strong editorial opinion, but I admire the Kerouac who set himself really formally free in his poetry, which is lesser known. But Kerouac's devotion to first thought, best thought, improvisation, and particularly in writing what he's hearing, becomes a kind of, for a lot of later poets who are not Kerouacian in their lifestyle, not Kerouacian in their politics certainly, they began to realize that what Kerouac was doing was a kind of close listening that generated poetry. And the spoken word. So when you get to Mod Po Plus for this week, for week 6, there's an explosion of examples of spoken word poetry, even to the point of the brief moment when MTV had a lot of poetry on it. There's Edwin Torres, who's affiliated at a certain point with the Nuyorican Poetry Cafe, who's very much a spoken poet with deference to the beats. And so, in sum, would you say that the beats have an influence on weeks 7, 8, 9, and 10?
Absolutely.
Yeah, how so?
Well, everybody's responding to what came before, whether to emulate or to go in a different way. But another thing about the beats is that there's something about physically exploring the world that is maybe a through line. You know, I'm thinking of even Creeley's I Know a Man, and we're in the car, and then you mentioned Kerouac, and we have road trips, and we have this, Ginsberg traveling to India. So it's a complicated, not a simple thing, but there's this idealistic desire to set out. So the poetry connects the poet to the world. The poet is not sitting alone in their chamber romanticizing. They are trying to be connected to the world.
And in this way, it is the revival, the most obvious in Mod Po, revival of the Whitmanian. And Ginsberg was overtly a Whitmanian. He saw Whitman in the supermarket. He wanted Whitman to point toward where he and we are going in America. So bringing Whitman back means connecting Ginsberg to a certain form of modern Americana. Bob Dylan would be a great example, who was kind of a, we might say, fellow traveler, to keep to the metaphor of traveling in that spirit. And there are the sensibility of a poet like Ted Berrigan, who's very much not a beat, but has a certain beat sensibility with respect to this. Bernadette Mayer, also not a beat poet, had some of that sensibility of wanting to be in touch with the ground, the American ground. Yeah. So it brings back the Whitman, it combines with the innovations of the avant-garde of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It's a very important thing. And I think also we should say that the Beat Week, as we call it in ModPo, is a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun.
Antic, satirical, funny, and self-critical people.
And also political, and part of the wanting to be in the streets and to hear what people are saying. I also want to mention Diane DePrima, who's in ModPo Plus, a very important beat poet who wrote these revolutionary letters and performed them in public. And so protest poetry and poetry that's paying attention to what's happening globally and locally.
And there's a connection back to the 1930s. So there's that one moment in week 5 where we look at the communist poets. Ginsberg revered those 1930s poets. And his mother, I think his mother, not his father, but his mother was involved with the same communist movement in the 1930s as these other poets. So Ginsberg connects us back. So what we try to do in ModPo, as you can see, is to make sure that we are separating and distinguishing these different movements, but they all have cross influences and cross currents. And it's our goal to create a certain set of convergences and even confusions of the different categories. Well, thank you very much, Laynie.
Thank you.
All right, week 6, it's great.